Random House Audio presents The Girl Who Kicked the Hornet's Nest by Stieg Larsson. Translated from the Swedish by Reg Keeland. Read for you by Simon Vance. Part 1. Intermezzo in a Corridor. April 8th to 12th. An estimated 600 women served during the American Civil War. They had signed up, disguised as men. Hollywood has missed a significant chapter of cultural history here. Or is this history ideologically too difficult to deal with? Historians have often struggled to deal with women who do not respect gender distinctions, and nowhere is that distinction more sharply drawn than in the question of armed combat. Even today it can cause controversy having a woman on a typical Swedish moose hunt. But from antiquity to modern times, there are many stories of female warriors, of Amazons. The best known find their way into the history books as warrior queens, rulers as well as leaders. They have been forced to act as any Churchill, Stalin, or Roosevelt. Semiramis from Nineveh, who shaped the Assyrian Empire, and Boudicca, who led one of the bloodiest English revolts against the Roman forces of occupation, to cite just two. Boudicca is honoured with a statue on the Thames at Westminster Bridge, opposite Big Ben. Be sure to say hello to her if you happen to pass by. On the other hand, history is reticent about women who were common soldiers, who bore arms, belonged to regiments, and took part in battles on the same terms as men, though hardly a war has been waged without women soldiers in the ranks. Chapter 1. Friday, April 8th. Dr. Jonasson was woken by a nurse 5 minutes before the helicopter was expected to land. It was just before 1:30 in the morning. "What?" he said, confused. "Rescue service helicopter coming in. 2 patients, an injured man and a younger woman. The woman has gunshot wounds." "All right," Jonasson said wearily. Although he had slept for only half an hour, he felt groggy. He was on the night shift in the ER at Sahlgrenska Hospital in Göteborg. It had been a strenuous evening. By 12:30, the steady flow of emergency cases had eased off. He had made a round to check on the state of his patients and then gone back to the staff bedroom to try to rest for a while. He was on duty until 6, and seldom got the chance to sleep, even if no emergency patients came in. But this time he had fallen asleep almost as soon as he turned out the light. Jonasson saw lightning out over the sea. He knew that the helicopter was coming in the nick of time. All of a sudden a heavy downpour lashed at the window. The storm had moved in over Göteborg. He heard the sound of the chopper and watched as it banked through the storm squalls down towards the helipad. For a second he held his breath when the pilot seemed to have difficulty controlling the aircraft. Then it vanished from his field of vision, and he heard the engine slowing to land. He took a hasty swallow of his tea and set down the cup. Jonasson met the emergency team in the admissions area. The other doctor on duty took on the first patient who was wheeled in, an elderly man with his head bandaged, apparently with a serious wound to the face. Jonasson was left with the second patient, the woman who had been shot. He did a quick visual examination. It looked like she was a teenager, very dirty and bloody and severely wounded. He lifted the blanket that the rescue service had wrapped around her body and saw that the wounds to her hip and shoulder were bandaged with duct tape, which he considered a very clever idea. The tape kept bacteria out and blood in. One bullet had entered her hip and gone straight through the muscle tissue. He gently raised her shoulder and located the entry wound in her back. There was no exit wound. The round was still inside her shoulder. He hoped it had not penetrated her lung, and since he did not see any blood in the woman's mouth, he concluded that probably it had not. "Radiology," he told the nurse in attendance. That was all he needed to say. Then he cut away the bandage that the emergency team had wrapped around her skull. He froze when he saw another entry wound. The woman had been shot in the head, and there was no exit wound there either. Jonasson paused for a second, looking down at the girl. He felt dejected. He often described his job as being like that of a goalkeeper. Every day people came to his place of work in varying conditions, but with one objective: to get help. Jonasson was the goalkeeper who stood between the patient and funus funeral service. His job was to decide what to do. If he made the wrong decision, the patient might die, or perhaps wake up disabled for life. Most often he made the right decision because the vast majority of injured people had an obvious and specific problem. A stab wound to the lung or a crushing injury after a car crash were both particular and recognizable problems that could be dealt with. The survival of the patient depended on the extent of the damage and on Jonassen's skill. There were two kinds of injury that he hated. One was a serious burn case, because no matter what measures he took, the burns would almost inevitably result in a lifetime of suffering. The second was an injury to the brain. The girl on the gurney could live with a piece of lead in her hip and a piece of lead in her shoulder, but a piece of lead inside her brain was a trauma of a wholly different magnitude. He was suddenly aware of his nurse saying something. "Sorry, I wasn't listening."
"It's her."
"What do you mean?"
"It's Lisbeth Salander. The girl they've been hunting for the past few weeks for the triple murder in Stockholm."
Jonassen looked again at the unconscious patient's face. He realized at once that the nurse was right. He and the whole of Sweden had seen Salander's passport photograph on billboards outside every newspaper kiosk for weeks. And now the murderer herself had been shot, which was surely poetic justice of a sort. But that was not his concern. His job was to save his patient's life, irrespective of whether she was a triple murderer or a Nobel Prize winner. Or both. Then the efficient chaos, the same in every ER the world over, erupted. The staff on Jonassen's shift set about their appointed tasks. Salander's clothes were cut away. A nurse reported on her blood pressure, 100/70, while the doctor put his stethoscope to her chest and listened to her heartbeat. It was surprisingly regular, but her breathing was not quite normal. Jonassen did not hesitate to classify Salander's condition as critical. The wounds in her shoulder and hip could wait until later, with a compress on each, or even with the duct tape that some inspired soul had applied. What mattered was her head. Jonassen ordered tomography with a new and improved CT scanner that the hospital had lately acquired. Jonassen had a view of medicine that was at times unorthodox. He thought doctors often drew conclusions that they could not substantiate. This meant that they gave up far too easily. Alternatively, they spent too much time at the acute stage trying to work out exactly what was wrong with the patient so as to decide on the right treatment. This was correct procedure, of course. The problem was that the patient was in danger of dying while the doctor was still doing his thinking. But Jonassen had never before had a patient with a bullet in her skull. Most likely he would need a brain surgeon. He had all the theoretical knowledge required to make an incursion into the brain, but he did not by any means consider himself a brain surgeon. He felt inadequate, but all of a sudden he realized that he might be luckier than he deserved. Before he scrubbed up and put on his operating clothes, he sent for the nurse. "There's an American professor from Boston working at the Karolinska Hospital in Stockholm. He happens to be in Göteborg tonight, staying at the Elite Park Avenue on Avenyn. He just gave a lecture on brain research. He's a good friend of mine. Could you get the number?" While Jonassen was still waiting for the X-rays, the nurse came back with a number of the Elite Park Avenue. Jonassen picked up the phone. The night porter at the Elite Park Avenue was very reluctant to wake a guest at that time of night, and Jonassen had to come up with a few choice phrases about the critical nature of the situation before his call was put through. "Good morning, Frank," Jonassen said when the call was finally answered. "It's Anders. Do you feel like coming over to Sahlgrenska to help out in a brain-op?" "Are you bullshitting me?" Dr. Frank Ellis had lived in Sweden for many years and was fluent in Swedish, albeit with an American accent, but when Jonassen spoke to him in Swedish, Ellis always replied in his mother tongue. "The patient is in her mid-20s. Entry wound, no exit." "And she's alive?" "Weak, but regular pulse. Less regular breathing. Blood pressure 100/70. She also has a bullet wound in her shoulder and another in her hip, but I know how to handle those two." "Sounds promising," Ellis said. "Promising? If somebody has a bullet in their head and they're still alive, that points to hopeful." "I understand. Frank, can you help me out?" "I spent the evening in the company of good friends, Anders. I got to bed at 1, and no doubt I have an impressive blood alcohol content." "I'll make the decisions and do the surgery. But I need...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?